These 5 color theory tips helped me unlock the ability to pick, blend, and control colors in a way that helped me tell better stories and create better art, and I want to share them with you. Each of these tips is built upon the last, so be sure to watch the video in order, starting with a quick rundown of value, which is the lightness or darkness of a color. It adds depth and contrast to your art, and understanding it creates convincing shading and helps to evoke specific moods. Everything we're going to do with color is built upon a solid understanding of value. I've got a video where I share how I learned value in the context of drawing a face, if that's of interest, but this video is about color, so let's just get into that. If you're just getting into understanding color, painting simple household objects and doing still lifes is your best bet in exploding your color understanding. Taking pictures of different things and putting them under different lighting will help you understand how hue and saturation change based on an object's properties and surroundings. Working with subjects like fruit also simplifies the learning process by eliminating the complexity of simultaneously mastering color and dealing with facial proportions. And you can grab the brushes I'm using from the channel Lighting Mentor. I'll have Jeremy's channel linked in the description. Painting any still life involves an understanding of the 3 factors that affect color: hue, saturation, and brightness. Throughout the entire process, I keep these 3 things in mind, especially at the start when I decide what the local color of my orange is going to be. Local color is what I think the color of the orange will be if there was no light or shadow on it. I do this by first deciding the hue of the orange, and that looks about right, and the saturation probably around 70%. It also looks pretty bright. If my local color looks a bit dull, that's okay, because as I add more information, I can compare the colors I've put down and adjust them. Another important aspect of color is its relativity. Colors appear different depending on their surroundings. That's why it's so important never to dive straight into the details and instead to get as much color as possible on your canvas so you can confirm your color selections. The light appears brighter, less saturated, and leans towards a more yellowy hue, while the shadow takes on the opposite characteristics. In most color scenarios, that's what you're going to experience. I'll continue adding some color variation, blending, adding some more reds here, saturation there, and squinting my eyes and comparing my reference to my orange to make sure my color choices are as accurate as possible. I'm also checking my values here and seeing if the surrounding is affecting my orange in any way or not. After I learned to do some still lifes, I got into painting more complicated scenarios than just fruit. I found this really nice reference and felt like I had to paint it. There were a lot of colors here, and there's a pretty apparent blue tinge on the shadows, which is a result of the surroundings. There's some yellows and reds being reflected between the different planes of the church as well, and overall it's an interesting challenge. The same concepts discussed earlier were applied here, although finding the local color was a lot trickier. In scenarios like this, it's best to just keep going with the painting, and as you progress with it, you can sort of chip away at what you think the color selections will be as you add more colors to your canvas, because as discussed earlier, colors are relative. So after messing around with still lifes, doing more complicated scenarios as well, and even getting into some portraits, you've probably got the hang of color. So let's step up the game with some efficiency. Skip the 1 to 2 hour routine, see what you can whip up in just 15 minutes. It's a speedy test to flex your color picking and blending skills. In doing this, you can pick some photos of environments to do some studies from, which gives you an opportunity to test how color and light affects the surrounding environment. Like I'm doing here with this rocky landscape, not focusing on the details or texture, but just using some basic shapes to block out the rocks, adding in some reds for color variation and trying to get the local colors down and making sure I'm color shifting in a correct way, adding the necessary saturation and reflective light that represents the environment. I used all these methods to practice and to improve my color skills. Now let's start using all the observational color skills we've gained to paint the same scene under different lighting scenarios. By doing this, we can observe how colors would change depending on the scene. Here I painted this reference and repainted it 5 other times under different times of year with some additional references on the side to help me with each run. Here's how I fared. This was by far the easiest because it was just me painting what I saw on the reference, so there was no need to invent anything, and its process followed the same structure as tip 3. This is similar to the previous one, but instead here I needed to use some more rich, warm colors. So I'm laying down orange, reds, yellows and browns atop the previous painting, with each of these warm tones having varying saturation to accommodate for the scene. I tried to keep the relationship between the more saturated and cooler areas the same, even though with this scenario, everything is going to by default be a little more saturated and warmer. For this one, I looked at my reference and knew I had to turn this bright environment into one that had more cool tones to reflect the winter theme. So whites, blues, purples, and greys were going to be a staple here, along with the snowy texture. I also changed the sky accordingly, similar to what my other reference image had. Now, with the nighttime scene, it's similar to the winter one in the sense that I needed some cooler tones, but here we're opting for more deep blues, purples, and blacks, where there can be strong areas of saturation. I washed everything with cool saturated colors and added a moon crescent as per my reference image. I don't know what to call this lighting scenario, but I took inspiration from this reference image I had and tried to replicate the color and scene from it. This scene had more pastel colors, so some brightness with a little less saturation had to be applied here. I also added some blues to the trees and pockets of rich saturated red. Finally, with this golden hour type scenario, I went back to the warm orange-yellow palette with some slight reds. I also made sure to keep it saturated, and since the sun was rising behind all the trees, I put some long drop shadows and introduced some more color variation to the sky. There also should be some backlighting occurring around the outskirts of the trees, which I failed to properly capture here. This is another exercise that can help a lot with specific scenes that you want to paint. Like if the reference pose that you have is perfect but the lighting sucks and you want to use a different lighting scenario. To do this, however, you need to have a strong understanding of the planes and forms of the face, so you know exactly where you're putting your light and shadow. I started this off with a sketch, I stylized the proportions a bit, but the main elements remained the same. My focus then shifted to the left reference as I aimed to nail the local color, throw in some color variation, and work on the subsurface scattering, all in one layer. The process involved darkening one area with shadow, adding light to compensate, and repeating the cycle. I sprinkled in some color variation and aimed for smooth transitions between planes using a mix of soft and textured brushes, as well as a mixer brush. I honed in on the spherical shape of the mouth, the drop shadow under the nose, and the sharp edge from the forehead bump. I smoothed the shadow areas on the cheeks, introducing additional texture for the transition. I employed a multiply layer with an airbrush to darken select areas and a color dodge layer for extra brightness, injecting red saturation for the light and shadow transitions. While it's not an exact match to the reference, I was able to take its main elements as best as I could and use them to paint something new.